policy statements, yeah.
So that's been carefully looked at through these hearings, and lots of evidence about the relationship between the unitary plan provisions and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So there's a lot of discussion on that, and so the panel will be looking at that very carefully. The panel is required to ensure that its recommendations are consistent with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So the panel is required to follow this hierarchy. If it doesn't follow that hierarchy, then I guess we're back into this whole discussion around, well, if we were to reject it, we would have to be rejecting it based on evidence before the panel or our own case before the panel. But yeah, our case to date has very much ensured that we're presenting evidence to the panel that is consistent with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Okay, so just contents of the regional, oh sorry.
No, just making sure. Oh, Councillor.
I just got a question that goes to section 32 that goes back to the previous question I asked. And let's say we have a situation where there's a bundle of councillors and they want to make a decision, and that decision's in the majority around disagreeing with something from the independent hearings panel, and let's say that the council's own evidence doesn't provide enough support, maybe because the council didn't think about it, whatever, but there is evidence in the form of submitters evidence, and they've got experts to support that. Are we going to be in a position where we can put something together against a background where it might be said, oh, you know, the council can't find anybody on its team to support, but that might be simply because council didn't think about it. But there are people out there that can, that we could pull in.
When we get to the stage of giving advice to you, to the council on the recommendations, it won't be about whether or not we can support the recommendations, it's whether or not we believe the recommendations are the appropriate recommendations in terms of those aspects that James talked about, the RMA, the Section 5 and 6 and 7 aspects, all of those sorts of things. If in those recommendations there we recommend a rejection, or a councillor identifies an area where they believe it should be rejected and we don't have the Section 32 information, as I said earlier, we will have on standby the officers in the council who do cost-benefit analysis to help firm up a Section 32 analysis if that rejection is something this council wants to do and we have an alternative provision. I can't say how hard or easy that will be because it would depend on what the actual provision is, but we would not discount, if this council wanted to reject something in the recommendations, it would not be for us to say, oh, we can't do that because we can't do a Section 32 analysis. We will do the best Section 32 analysis we can within the time frame, and we would hope that by the time we got, if that was appealed, by the time we got to the Environment Court, we have beefed up our evidence around that. But we would not be recommending you don't reject something just based on the fact we don't have a Section 32 analysis at the moment.
And just further to the Section 32 analysis, I'm assuming that we'll also look at how strong the Section 32 analysis is of the independent hearings panel, particularly if their decision isn't being made on maybe enough to substantiate it.
Well, that will be part of our analysis of the reasons they've given for amending the plan. We'll certainly look at that.
Okay.
All right, so just some basics around the contents of a regional policy statement. Regional policy statements don't include rules, but they do include the issues of significance to the region as a whole, so in this case all of Auckland. What are the big macro issues for Auckland? So the regional policy statement and the unitary plan certainly takes a very strong lead from the Auckland plan in that regard, because a lot of the thinking was done around the development of the Auckland plan. They must also have clear objectives in relation to those issues, some policies, essentially the how to achieve those objectives. And sorry, just to point that out. The objectives are really the what. What is council trying to achieve, by when and where in Auckland? That's the sort of the gist of an objective. The policies are more the sort of how will it be achieved. And then regional policy statements can include methods, not rules, but they can identify ways that the council would look to achieve the objectives in the regional policy statement. And the key one is for the regional policy statement to then refer to the fact that we have district plan rules for things like heights and densities and heritage and so on. So the regional policy statement will make a reference to those, but it doesn't include the rules per se. This is just the basics of how the RMA is structured. And then you get to the regional and district plan rules. So again, we have to have objectives in a regional or a district plan. We don't have to identify the issues. It's kind of a given that the issues are identified in the higher order document, which is the regional policy statement. Again, a regional and a district plan must include policies, and they generally have to include rules as well. Without rules, they're pretty toothless. So you won't find any district plans or regional plans in the country that don't have rules. And there are two key types of rules. There are activity controls, things like where you can and can't have retail or housing or industry, and then what we call development controls, which are the sort of standards around heights and setbacks, hours of operation for businesses, those sorts of things we tend to call development controls. And then regional and district plans, as an option, they can have assessment criteria to guide the assessment of a resource consent application. But those are the sort of mechanics, the nuts and bolts of the different RMA documents. Any questions on that?
Yeah, just got a question, and it may not be covered off here. If we look at the special housing area process, one of the considerations that we've had in that process that's been really important is timing, especially timing of infrastructure. So if we're in a position where we simply can't afford the infrastructure, we just can't do it, and that could be multiple things, sewage, water, all sorts. We've basically put it off. Now, with the unitary plan as it stands now, we're going to have upzoning, well, almost everywhere, all across Auckland, and we know that we're going to have immense difficulty coping with that. That we may not be able to cope with it financially, especially with the limited development contributions that we've got. So is there anything we can do about timing in terms of the process?
So particularly in terms of greenfield land, the unitary plan makes reference to staged sequenced release of new greenfield areas, and that will be in accordance with the Council's future urban land supply strategy. So we do have a staging approach recognised in the unitary plan for new greenfield areas. In terms of the brownfield areas, the planning for infrastructure is clearly an iterative thing alongside the planning for land use, and so we've had Watercare, Auckland Transport, sort of enmeshed in this whole process, providing evidence in support of the provisions in the plan for infrastructure. So it's iterative. I'm not quite sure where the question is going further than that.
Let's say we've got some out-of-scope stuff that is essentially applying to brownfield areas, and it's taking a whole area and you've got upzoning across that wasn't envisaged and wasn't part of council's evidence. So we're going to have a massive exercise providing infrastructure, educational facilities, parks and the like in an area where the land's not available.
But the zoning doesn't mean it's getting done.
I'm just asking the
No,
question.
I think, and councillor, you're asking what probably a lot of people out there would like to know. I think this is where the explanation of how planning works is critical. Just because it's zoned doesn't mean it's going to happen now, but I don't think we've been able to state that in an understood and articulate fashion. So can we just give a bit of a
Could I just make
around that?
a quick comment? we've clearly got a principle that applies to greenfield areas, and that applies largely around the provision of infrastructure.
Yep.
I'm suggesting that that principle equally applies to brownfield areas,
Yep.
particularly when you've got a massive effect, and we're talking about massive effects. So I'm just putting that on the table. The principle is there. Can we apply it?
So I think, as John has said, in the council's case, it is taken towards the way the zones are applied has been informed by the infrastructure providers of water care, stormwater, Auckland Transport. So in our case, infrastructure readiness was a consideration of where the zones were applied. Your question was if the panel makes an out-of-scope recommendation to considerably upzone an area that there have been no submissions, and in their view they have indicated that is out of scope, because as James has said, it's the panel that makes that call, not anybody else. So if they have an out of scope recommendation, that when we look at it and in conjunction with our conversations with our council family, because they will all be part of the team looking at the recommendations, the infrastructure people said there is no way that we can provide the infrastructure in this area, then we can reject an out-of-scope recommendation. And if we reject it, that's the end of the conversation. There is no appeal rights. So that's the answer to your question about if they came up with an out-of-scope recommendation. The question that we are not clear on yet is the panel has to determine what is out of scope, and we've got no indication, we won't get that until they give us their recommendations about what they believe is out of scope or not.
Sorry, Councillor Walker, I was just going to add a gloss on that. You started the conversation, or the question, with reference to the special housing areas. We need to remember, of course, that
It's
that's a different test, and that the infrastructure provision there needs to be immediate or very close to immediate to enable the development to take place in a short period of time. The planning horizons in the RMA and unitary plan are longer. So it's a consideration, as Penny Purrett said, but it's not a mandatory consideration in the same way it is with special housing areas.
I mean, I understand that the planning provisions are longer. Nevertheless, when the plan comes into effect, the impact is potentially immediate.
No.
In terms of...
Madam Chair, can we get this perfectly
That's
clear?
why I
Because
was
I'm hoping, I don't think the officers actually explained it properly. Because there's a zone, this has been the whole problem all the way through. Because there's a zoning put on an area, it doesn't mean to say that's going to be taken up straight away. And that's been the problem. So if they actually decided that an area was upzoned in brownfields, until someone actually starts building there, in which case they then probably need to put in infrastructure or do a small plan of what they're going to do, nothing will happen. And we've had people sitting on future urban land for years that have never done anything with it. So this goes back to the whole confusion about the unitary plan as opposed to, you know, other plans. It's not a plan change, it's a zoning plan, and the zones may not be taken up for quite some time. Or have I got it totally wrong?
Through you, Madam Chair, my question was directed to the officers, not to Councillor Webster.
And I think
I'm trying to clarify it with
It
the
hasn't, it's muddied it.
we're all no. Can we just get really clear from either any of our team up here when something is operative in the unitary plan, i.e. brownfields or greenfields, redevelopment, rezoning, does or doesn't the issue of infrastructure availability come into the decision whether to allow that to be developed at that stage or not? We just need to get clear about that, because this is an ongoing issue that we're going to face.
I think the first answer is that district plan rules, unitary plan rules only enable development to happen. They do not make it happen. And as Councillor Webster says, it becomes very much the choice of the landowner about whether or not they want to take up the opportunities that the unitary plan might provide. In response to the question about infrastructure, there are 2 levels of infrastructure assessment that happens with planning. So at the time when you are looking at applying the zone, there's a high-level assessment about whether the bulk infrastructure in that area has the capacity for growth. And as John and I have said, that is the conversation that we've had with our infrastructure providers all along the development of the unitary plan. And they have assured us that where we have indicated, both in the proposed plan and in the council's case, where there is the opportunity for further housing, that the bulk infrastructure is in place or will be in place and to enable it to occur.